Welcome to Reluctantly Supernatural in an Age of Reason, the podcast where we explore the place of the supernatural gifts of the Holy Spirit in our lives and in the church. Our hosts, Pastors Mark Cowpersmith and Bob Maddox, combine their years of ministry experience to address the issues of the prophetic gifts in our modern world. Join us as they interview their guests from a wide variety of spiritual leadership backgrounds, as they share their insights on the place of the supernatural in the church and the world. And now, our hosts, Mark Cowpersmith and Bob Maddox.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of Reluctantly Supernatural, our podcast. Mark and I are so excited today to welcome one of my dearest friends, old friend, I should say. Not that he's that old, but I'm the old guy here. But he is a friend from many years ago, and this guy is a uniter, a pastor, a prophetic, gifted, talented guy that I've always admired, even from his young days as a Christian. And I've just seen the way God has used him across the body of Christ. And I'm just thrilled that Francis Anfuso is with us today. So we're going to ask him some questions, and he's going to tell us his story. Francis, it's so great to have you here today.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, it's so good to be
with you. You're one of my heroes from the early innings. Again, I was a baby Christian, 72. You were ancient. You were 5 years in the Lord.
Yeah, we thought the Lord was coming back any moment.
You were the seasoned sage. I'd look up and
that's awesome.
Yeah,
I love it. Thank you, Francis. Well, you know, Francis, I remember when I met you, you had just come out of the hippie culture. You guys were living in the commune across the street from that little church there in Smartsville. But tell us about your conversion and what was some of the keys that really brought you and a lot of those hippies into Christ?
Sure. Well, I was raised on the East Coast. My father was in politics, so I went away to boarding school when I was 11. Never lived at home again. So that put a lot of father wounds in me. Became an atheist at 15 for 7 years. Then went to university all 5 years. I was an atheist, in-your-face atheist. Hedonistic, anarchistic atheist. And so got involved in the whole hippie drug counterculture, went across the country in a hippie van in the fall of 1971. We actually are doing a movie about that. So we filmed a few scenes already. We filmed my suicidal scene in that deal. We filmed my conversion scene, me going across San Francisco Bay in a little dinghy with one oar for an hour and a half. I mean, crazy stuff. We filmed a few things already. But going back to that moment in time, I had come out of a relationship with a girl. I'd had an abortion with her. I had another one previously. And I was really coming to the end of myself. I was suicidal for 6 months. Every day I contemplated killing myself. And so in that desert, walked out by myself with a dull pocket knife, began to carve on my wrist, screamed out, didn't know what I said. But I said, God help me. I wouldn't have acknowledged it then, but I screamed, God help me. Then my friends didn't know what to do with me. My twin brother, my best friend, the ex-girlfriend, a few others. So they put me on a plane in Sacramento a week later. The girl I gave $100 to get the abortion with, she gave me $100 to get on a plane, get out of her life. I went to Maui and lived in Hawaii for 6 months, got further into Eastern religions at that time, came back, went to see my twin brother. At that point, you could send a little postcard and say, hey, I'm camped out on a river. General delivery, Lahaina, Maui. I'm camped out on a river. Come find me. I said, with that amount of specific information, absolutely. So went up to Nevada City, was about a day behind him. Then I decided to visit that friend who was in the van. He and I had actually knelt on a beach in the island of Molokai a few months before and prayed, Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, we have studied your teachings. You're all not the same person. Would you reveal yourself to us? I did not know, but he had gotten saved. So I went to see him. It'll be 50 years ago, Mother's Day, this next year. And he had gotten saved. And so I'm coming in, I have my whole little mystical thing that I'm doing. And he just seems rather unimpressed. I'm going to South America with a woman. And so I figured he'd want to cash in on the deal. But he's like, none of it's interesting. And so I said, what are you into? And he describes how he went into the woods for a month and chanted to Krishna. You know, the flowers, the fruit, the picture, all that, just chanted his brains out and was losing his mind. And he said, and we filmed this scene as well, too. He went into an Episcopal church midday a church he had grown up as a child, knew nothing about it, saffron robe, barefoot, long hair, beard, and knelt down in the front and said, Jesus, I don't know anything about you since I was a little child, but if you're real, reveal yourself to me. He said at that point, he was knocked backwards. I'm listening to him, and he's a credible source. This is not, the Jesus freaks I'd argue with. This is a guy who, he was my peer, he was my friend. And now he shares his story, knocked backward. All the questions were lifted off him, and I'm listening. And so I'm trying to catch up conversationally. So I said, well, I'm into Jesus. He goes, no, Francis, just Jesus. I'm going, Jesus. Just Jesus. Like, it seemed like a narrow little box, But he was, again, a fully vetted person. That night went up to the Smartsville Church, and we actually filmed there September 11th of this year. With me, I had these beads on. I used to chant to Krishna, beads on. I was traveling with a woman from the planet Venus. I am sorry, I apologize for that. But a turquoise necklace. And so I was being choked. Once I invited Jesus in, I said, Jesus, help me. I'm being choked by the necklaces. My hands were frozen at my side. I prayed my first prayer as a believer. One of my hands came up, ripped the beads off. We filmed that whole scene in a room full of people now. And I could breathe, and I became born again. Stayed up that night interrogating people till 1 a.m, and I was off to the races. So that's how I got saved.
Man, that's an awesome thing, isn't it? God is just, when he goes after us, he knows how to bring us home.
He does. And it was on Mother's Day. I knew it was my mother's prayers. She'd pray over her food, and I would laugh at her. I mean, wow. If there was a mean, vindictive God, he would have smacked me in the head. But she would just laugh out loud as she was praying. But her prayers got me on Mother's Day 50 years ago. And so anyway, I was ordained an evangelist within 6 months. That other guy, Bruce was his name. And so I was off to the races, spent a number of years as an evangelist, but I'd watch people minister in the gifts of the Spirit. And man, I just did not have a clue. It was almost like there was an atmosphere where the prophet would come in, if it was a presbytery or something. And there was a lot of stuff around it that had personality. They would maybe change the way they spoke. The Lord would say unto you, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I can do that. My goodness, do I have to change my language? Did Jesus change his language? I mean, how do you do this? So I began to pastor that community. The Jesus movement dried up, but they needed someone to pastor that community. So I got saved in 72, 77. I went up supposedly for 6 months. 4 years and 4 months later, I was done there. But while I was there, the Lord one day spoke to me, taking a shower, and said, I'm going to teach you how to hear my voice. Wow. And my initial response was just conversationally in my head, no audible voice. I said, well, I know nothing about the subject, but he just encouraged me. That was the whole point, that I could start fresh. At that point, began to then fast a lot and pray. And we then wrote a textbook called Spirit-Led Evangelism. We had already been traveling with a seminar at that point called Glad Tidings. And so we went through all the gospel verses, all the book of Acts, defined the gifts of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit, and just did a whole kind of expository teaching on the gifts. And then I began to step out, and over a probably 12, 15 year period, ministered over 16,000 people individually. So go to churches into late in the night, prophesying, ministry in the gifts of the Spirit. And then from there, once I stopped being an evangelist, began to pastor. And you can't be as fluid in that. You can't, walk up to people in the congregation and then expect them to come back next week if you, shared something publicly. So it became a lot more discreet, but still, ministering in the gifts of the Spirit. And now pastoring, then I pastored for 21 years. I retired 3 years ago, crowd surfed out, the crowd. And, the topic of gifts of the Spirit, my daughter Havilah is writing a course right now. We're on day 11 of a 15-day course coming out in January. She'll probably have 25,000 people that will go through it, but it's on the gifts of the Spirit. So she's, the girls grew up in that atmosphere, and so they became very prolific in it at an early age, and really were kind of baptized in it.
That was just amazing. Mark, I tell you, I've known Francis for years, but it was just great hearing his story again.
Well, Bob, you got some wild friends. That's all I could say. I love these stories. They're larger than life, but they're true.
Yeah.
And, characters, I think of the Apostle Paul. I think of his conversion on the road. And I think of these absolutely dramatic conversions. A guy's running as hard as he can into the New Age and all of the Eastern mysticism and the whole hippie culture. And the next thing he knows, he's running just as hard in the opposite direction towards a relationship with God. I love that part of his story.
That guy, the friend of his chanting and to Chris, I don't know what it is, but suddenly there was this hunger for something more. I mean, we were very hedonistic generation. We've been spoiled, raised with parents that were very materialistic after World War II, and they wanted their kids to have everything. But for some reason, there was this hunger for something deeper, and we tried drugs and sex and all that stuff. And yet, and so when it came to God, we were just, I guess, as intense about that as we were about the other things.
I remember growing up in those days, and I think the high school I went to was we called it the country club. There was a lot of rich kids there, and they've got all these blessings. They've got the privilege and everything else, but they're not happy. And we were empty. These kids were empty. I wasn't one of the rich ones, but I hung around with them, and nobody was particularly happy. We wanted something more. That something more sends you on a search.
Yeah.
And it can end in a lot of places. For me, it ended with the Lord. But I think one of the values that can happen to you when you're young is being disillusioned with life as it is, where you start to say, there's got to be something more. As soon as you start saying that, there's got to be something more, God has access to lead you.
Yeah.
And Bob, it's not just about values like whether we're materialistic or what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, or I'm going to start a business? It's not questions like that. It's what really matters. And as soon as you become disillusioned with the present, even Christianity, like I was thinking of our interview with Les Meredith, where he was talking about there's got to be something more. If this is all there is, there's just not much to it. That hunger put him in a position to receive more from God and to be led by God. And I think Francis is the same way. He was so hungry. He was ready to kill himself.
Yeah.
A life without purpose and meaning. And he was ready to kill himself. And before you know it, he has all the purpose he can handle for the rest of his life.
And
something else.
What it did? It birthed out of that. God just stepped into that void and started drawing people. And what I'm hoping is that right now, the drug of our age is the internet and the social media and technology. That's the drug of our age, but it's empty too. And I'm just praying a generation are just going to start to sense that and look for something more.
I think they are looking. They're not looking in the right place yet.
Yeah.
But they're looking. A person who's searching is a person who finds. The one that doesn't search doesn't find.
Yeah.
So I think we need to pray for that, for growing hunger, especially in our youth, for something more. I really liked what he said. He became a Christian, he became an evangelist, but he didn't step into the things of the Spirit right away.
Mm-hmm.
There was a learning curve there. There must be more. There's got to be something more to this. Especially you read the book of Acts and you think, why isn't that happening today? Something's wrong somewhere. But he said, he was watching these guys move in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and they got the preacher voice. They go into some weird speech impediment, trying to sound spiritual or religious. I love that he called that fake. He didn't use the word fake, but he was pretty much like, I can't be like that. That isn't really real. I think it behooves us to be very flexible in our delivery of how we present the things of the Spirit to people, so style doesn't become more important than substance.
Yeah.
To say, hey, this is the way you got to do it because this is the way I did it. This is the way you have to appear when you're doing it because this is the way I appeared when I was doing it. All that is going to do is provide an impediment to somebody coming into the things of the Spirit. But he got through it. He rejected the part that was culturally inaccessible to him, but he still found the real thing. And I think that's fantastic.
And that set him on a journey. And in our next video that we do with him, our next interview, he's going to describe more of that journey and how God started to use him in those gifts. And maybe you've been turned off by some of the gifts that you've seen, or the way people operate in the gifts.
The way they operate in them.
Yeah. Because it's put on, you put on a posturing a certain way that, and God is not into that. That's what I love too about prayer. It doesn't have to be, some kind of elaborate thing. It's just really being very real and honest with God where you're at.
I was talking to a friend of mine from a conservative, it sounds funny, conservative Pentecostal background. There was a day when Pentecostal wasn't conservative, but he was from a conservative Pentecostal background. And we were talking about the movement that I was a part of in the 1980s, where I came into the things of the Spirit. And he started to listen to what I was saying. And he said, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And he went and listened to a whole bunch of John Wimber's materials. And he came back to me a week later and said, I've been listening to all these lectures by John Wimber. He said, he's fantastic. Why did I miss all that? And I said, why did you miss all that? And he said, because it was happening to hippies and surfer types. And he said, I judged them on their appearance, and I judged that it wasn't God because they were disrespectful in how they came to church. And he said, but I just realized I missed something wonderful. And I should have, my heart was closed and it should have been open. Wow. I think we've got to be the same way, very carefully with the next move of God, that we don't judge it through the lens of our experience or our style or what worked for us. We're going to have to adapt to them. They're not going to have to adapt to us.
Well, if you've been watching the podcast today and you don't want to miss it, I want to encourage you to get our book, Reluctantly Supernatural, or watch some of the other videos that are on our YouTube channel. You can get our book at Amazon.com, or you can go to our website, which is reluctantlysupernatural.com, and you can order it right there. But stick with us through this series, because Francis has got some amazing stories to tell us.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Reluctantly Supernatural podcast with your hosts, Mark Cowpersmith and Bob Maddox. Be sure to check out our website at www.reluctantlysupernatural.com or visit our YouTube channel, Reluctantly Supernatural, for more videos and podcasts. To get a copy of our book, Reluctantly Supernatural in an Age of Reason, you can purchase it at Amazon.com or order it directly from us at our website, www.reluctantlysupernatural.com.